Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Perry Spencer Crop Day. I know it's a little bit different than the way we usually do it, but we're really excited to be able to welcome today Dr. Rob Myers. Dr. Myers is an agronomist on the faculty of the University of Missouri. Much of his work over the years has focused on cover crops and cropping system diversification. He directs the Center for Regenerative Agriculture at University of Missouri and also serves as the Regional Director of Extension Programs for the North Central SARE program. He has led several national projects on cover crops and soil health while publishing over 50 articles specifically on cover crop management and use. He grew up on a family grain farm in central Illinois. So Dr. Myers, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, I'm glad to be with you all from a distance. So yes, I'm based in central Missouri, Columbia, Missouri. I grew up on a grain farm in Illinois, as Sarah mentioned, and we actually had cover crops on our farm when I was young in the 1960s. When we stopped having wheat in the 1970s, the cover crops disappeared from the farm, but then they came back about, I guess about 8 years ago. And so I helped my mom, my dad's passed away, helped my mom manage our 400-acre farm in central Illinois, and I'm glad to say it's completely cover cropped this year, and cover crops are looking pretty good coming into the spring here. So I was asked to talk to you about some of the latest things that are happening with cover crops, and boy, there's a lot happening across the U.S. I am going to show you a little bit of data from Indiana that I hope you find interesting, but mainly we'll be looking at some trends across both the Midwest and nationally. So there's three types of things I wanted to share with you in terms of some trend information. So some things we can gain insights from the USDA Census of Ag, because that's been really our best look at where cover crop acreage is in places like Indiana and the rest of the US. I'll spend the majority of my time on some information that farmers have shared from a national survey that's run through my office on cover crop use, and it's pretty interesting to see what farmers are reporting with that. And then we'll kind of end up with some equipment things. Some of this may be familiar, but maybe some new things you haven't seen yet with equipment. So with that, we'll go ahead and kind of dive into the census data here. So again, the most recent Census of Ag, any of you that have filled out a census form know that's done once every 5 years. So the most recent census was 2017. The data was released in 2019. And I and one of my staff kind of went through and made some maps and did some analysis of that data. So I just wanted to share some of that with you. So you can quickly see Indiana is in one of the top 4 states in the nation, or the ones with the greater acreage of cover crops. And then Texas is kind of the surprise there. When I first saw that, I wondered, well, why is Texas so high? I never thought of Texas as a major cropping state, cover cropping state. Well, what happens is they have a lot of winter wheat that gets planted that if it doesn't get enough moisture, instead of being harvested for grain, will just be declared a cover crop. And then either they'll go ahead and plant something like cotton or soybeans, or they'll have an insurance payment. So that's how they get so high on acreage. So where does Indiana stand in the Midwest? Well, you can see here in the middle part of your screen, Indiana was second in Iowa with 936,000 acres. We saw that was bigger than 2012 by quite some margin, about a 50% increase in Indiana. And certainly one of the highest states in the Midwest, and like I said, in the top 4 nationally. And I'm going to switch my internet connection here real quick because I see that I'm getting an unstable signal, which certainly don't want that to happen. Hang on with me just a second here. Okay, we'll see if this works better. So there's 2 ways of looking at the survey data. One is the data I just showed you, kind of just the raw acres per state. But we did some extra analysis and we looked at, we know that in some states there's just a lot more potential. Obviously, Iowa has probably twice the row crop acreage of Missouri. Missouri has more row crop acres than Arkansas, and so on. So we went down to the county level and looked, what's the actual percent of land that could be cover cropped that's being cover cropped. So we took out hay fields, we took out forest, we took out CRP ground, we actually took out winter wheat, since you couldn't have a winter annual cover crop where we have winter wheat, and a few other things, wetland acres. And then we looked at the cropland base, and from that we calculated the percent of the potential cropland that could be cover crop that was actually cover crop. And when we do that, you can see, well, Indiana and Missouri are still in the top group in the Midwest with the green color, but under 10% in that year in 2017. However, the eastern part of the Corn Belt, we get into Pennsylvania or Tennessee, Kentucky, some of those areas, they are higher in percent row cover cropping. Maryland would be the highest at about 41% cover crop. So you might wonder, well, why is that? Why are they so high? Well, there's a couple things going on. One is that they've been at it for longer, going back to the early 90s. I worked at USDA in Washington in the mid 90s and lived in Maryland, and they had a big program even back then in like 1995 to push cover crops, which continues today. So there's been, over 25 years of education on cover crops in some of those eastern states, partly because of concerns for the Chesapeake Bay. So that's made a difference. You've got counties out there that are over half cover cropped, including in states like Pennsylvania. But there's also more wheat, and when we have small grains, that sometimes works well with cover cropping. Some of those states like Virginia have a lot of beef cattle that are grazed on cover crops. So lots of different factors. But the bottom line is it shows that it is possible to get states that have a fair amount of corn and soybean production into 30–40% cover crop range. Now you may be thinking, well, Indiana, we're 10% or less, but you might be surprised to see when we do this analysis, here's the middle column is the cover crop acres, just the raw numbers. But if we do this calculation, what's the percent of the available cropland that could be cover cropped? Well, then it's a different story. So Floyd County obviously didn't have a lot of cover crops. You look at Marion, again, not a huge amount, but LaGrange, I think up in the northern part of the state, if I remember, pretty good amount of cover crops and close to 25%. You see Pike and Washington, some down further south, they're green near Bloomington, close to 20%. So there are counties in Indiana, when you take out the hay fields and the forest and everything else, that a fair amount of the available cropland that could be cover crop is being cover crop. Now, still, we have a ways to go. Now, you're probably looking at this list and thinking, well, where's Perry County? Where's Spencer County? So let's take a look at that. Here's your two counties, and you're lower than these top 20, but Perry is in the top third of the states when I looked at the data, and Spencer would be in the top 40%. So not bad. And Spencer certainly has, they're over 10,000 acres as of 2017. I'm guessing you're higher than that now. I would presume Indiana's over 1 million acres of cover crops by now based on past trends. So just looking at the big picture nationally with cover crops, there were 15 million acres in 2017, and that was a 50% increase over 5 years earlier. I'm pretty confident based on a variety of data that we're probably at around 20 million acres of cover crops now. We've been on a pretty steady path overall of about 8% a year growth rate. Now, it definitely fluctuates from year to year. If we have a late fall, obviously we're going to get less cover crops planted. If we have an early fall, we're going to get a little bit more in the ground, but those are the general trends. I was pleasantly surprised to see how many farms are actually using cover crops. Over 150,000 farms a few years back using cover crops, and it's really all over the US. I used to hear a lot, well, cover crops is more of an Eastern US thing, but there's farms in Nevada, Montana, Idaho, New Mexico, all those Western states, almost every crop producing county, there's at least some farmers doing cover crops. There were 8 states that from 2012 to 17 more than doubled their cover crop acreage. And I think we're going to see that again at the next census, that there'll be some counties that have doubled their acreage again. Missouri's probably on that growth path. We've been really having rapid growth. There were 10 states, believe it or not, that had at least 20% cover cropped. And as I mentioned earlier, Maryland was actually over 40%, with some of their counties at 50% or more. And this is kind of the path we've been on. Again, no trend holds forever, but 2017 was 15 million acres. If we stayed on that path of 8% a year growth, by the next census of ag, we'd be about 23 million acres nationally. That may not sound huge compared to our cropland base, but then you look a little farther down the road towards the end of the decade, and we'd be getting towards 40 million acres. And a lot of the people I work with are hoping we can actually push that to 50 million acres by the end of the decade. In fact, I had a call today. The national pork producers are teaming up with the United Soybean Board and the national corn growers to look at a project that hasn't happened yet, but a look at a project to push us to 50 million acres by 2030. And I'm working on some other projects that way as well. So lots of excitement around cover crops right now. So that's some data from the census. I want to turn next to a national farmer survey. And what we've done through my office, the Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program, is we've surveyed farmers working with the Conservation Technology Information Center in Indiana. Probably many of you know that name. They're a nonprofit group that has done a variety of surveys over the years. And so they've helped us do the survey with farmers. We've also had support from the American Seed Trade Association. We haven't done this survey every year. We did it 5 years straight from 2012 to 17, and then we took a break and we did it again in 2019. So the data was reported in 2020, and I'm going to show you data from that most recent survey. So just to give you an idea where the farmers were responding, we had farmers in every state in the US or contiguous mainland US responding. And you can see Indiana was one of the highest here in the dark green. There were over 100 farmers in Indiana that provided survey responses. So from that survey data, we asked farmers how many acres they'd been planting of cover crops each of the last 5 years. And this is a very similar pattern to every year we've done the survey, that kind of steady growth, which matches that census data. So the average was 465 acres of cover crops. Now this included about 20% of those farmers were horticulture producers that would have been typically 100 acres or less. So if you took those out, the numbers just for corn and soybean producers probably would have been more like an average of 600 acres per farm for cover crops. We did have some data in that survey, if any of you are horticulture producers, on cover crop use. If you just did an internet search for SARE, S-A-R-E, cover crop survey, you can pull up the results. I'm just going to show you a small part of the data here because it was a long, detailed report with a lot of information in there. But I'm going to focus on some of the information for corn and soybeans primarily. So first question is yields, right? What happens when we have cover crops? We asked farmers, and typically about 1,500 to 2,000 farmers have responded to the survey. If you had fields with cover crops and fields with comparable management without cover crops, give us your yields. Now, a lot of farmers are 100% cover crops, so we don't use their data. We had other farmers, maybe they don't have similar management where they've got the two systems, but so this is about 500 farmers worth of data that we've been getting each year. And with the corn, very modest yield difference overall, only about 2%. And that fits with what we've seen in the past, typically 5% yield gain. And we typically see 3 to 5% in soybeans. And then wheat kind of in between at 2.6%. Now, we've seen years like the drought year of 2012, where that difference margin, the benefit to the cover crop are the blue bars, by the way, was bigger. Like in 2012, it was about 10% following corn, about 12% following soybeans. So, or for soybeans. So the cover crops can really help in a dry year. We've seen that data pretty consistently. We also asked about impact on cost, and I'm not going to take time to show you all that data, but I want to just mention a little bit about fertilizers and then herbicides. So we asked in cornfields where you've used cover crops for, at least a few years in consecutive years, how has the cover crop use impacted your fertilizer cost for that corn? And about half said that they didn't change anything. And I've heard that over and over just talking individually to farmers. They may say, well, yeah, I think probably getting some nutrient benefits from the cover crops, but I'm just sticking with my regular fertilizer program. And that's fine when people do that. There were 2% that said they had a little higher cost. I'm not sure why that is, but maybe they were putting on a little to graze the cover crop, help get growth on it. But about half were seeing some savings in the fertilizer cost. Some of them was quite modest, $5 or less an acre, but then on the other end, there was about 10% that were saving $20 an acre or more. And as you'd expect, the longer people used cover crops, the more they started to being able to cut back a little bit on those fertilizer costs. So what about herbicides? Well, this is a bit of a complex picture because there's so many different ways we use herbicides with residuals and burn downs and post-emergent sprays and so on. Again, a pretty big fraction, about 40%, said they didn't change any herbicide cost. And you can't quite read the last part of that line, but they said they got better weed control, even though they weren't changing the herbicide program. So that's significant. The 40% said that it was helping that way. There were some that didn't have any change, 15% in terms of weed control or cost. But then there's a pretty good fraction here that said they're having some savings. So there were some, about 7%, that saved as much as $20 or more an acre, but there were also some that had very modest savings. But when you put all those together, there's again about 40% that are saying they're having some savings in herbicide cost. Now, one of the things we're really interested in with cover crops is their impact on herbicide-resistant weeds. We know that these are becoming a bigger problem on many farms. My family farm in central Illinois, just the last few years, we've seen them start showing up. So, you know, our big three in terms of herbicide-resistant weeds are mare's tail, water hemp, and Palmer amaranth. And the good news is the cover crops can help with all three of those. They probably help the most with mare's tail. And that's because the mare's tail often gets started growing in the fall, especially in the southern half of the Corn Belt. So here, this is a farm that they had planted cereal rye, but they ran out of seed and had a little strip here that they didn't plant. This whole area had been sprayed with burned down glyphosate. So these mare's tail that are circled and you kind of see growing back through the field, these were tolerant of the glyphosate. They kept growing. But over here, where there's some cereal rye that had been killed by the glyphosate, you see there's absolutely zero mare's tail. And the farmer told me this was the case for the whole field, not a noticeable mare's tail anywhere in the rye, but look how thick it is without the rye. Now, I'm not going to say that's always going to happen, but I've seen some other fields like this with similar appearances. If we look at Palmer amaranth or water hemp, the cereal rye allelopathic chemicals can not knock those weeds out entirely, but they may slow their vigor and make it easier for the herbicide to knock out those weeds. So they kind of work in combination with the herbicides. Kind of looking on here, did we have some situations where somebody was paid to plant or establish the cover crop? Well, about 70% said they were planting their own cover crops. We also found that there were a fair number that said they paid an aerial applicator. That was about 15%. And then we had some that paid a neighbor, about 5% or so, and about 5% used an ag retailer. How about what are people planting? You're probably well aware that cereal rye is the most popular cover crop, and that's been supported by the survey over and over. Every year we ask that, we get the same story. It's more than twice as big as the next one, which is radishes. But radishes are surprisingly popular, especially in some parts of the Corn Belt. Then we also see oats as being pretty popular. People that maybe want something that'll winter kill might use oats. Among our brassicas, the mustard type plants, rapeseed or canola is popular because of its ability to overwinter. And then other ones besides radishes would be turnips in that category. Winter wheat is sometimes used instead of cereal rye if somebody wants a little less growth than might happen with the rye. Also, it's easy to get convenient seed at a low cost. Crimson clover doesn't show up till here, but it is the most popular legume. Now in southern Indiana, where you folks are at, you probably have some of you growing crimson clover. I've grown it about 20 years myself and really like crimson clover. For where I'm at in Missouri, if we were up in northern Indiana, we probably would look at some other legume options like hairy vetch or maybe Austrian winter pea or red clover, just because there's a hardiness issue once we get north of about I-70. If we've got good snow cover, it may survive further north, but just a little less reliable. So anyway, that's the picture when we talk about species overall. We also asked farmers about when you have cover crops in a mix, what's your most popular species to use in a mix? Well, there, rye is still popular, but it's second behind radishes. Radishes are really popular in mixes for a variety of reasons. Oats are also popular. You see crimson clover has kind of moved up. It was in the middle of the pack as an individual species, but as far as a mix, it's quite popular there. So it's a little different story. How about incentive payments? You know, we've seen an increasing amount of incentive payments available from different sources, from NRCS through a couple of their programs. Their main two are the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. So that's the gray area here. We had a little bigger number that were responding saying that they had payments through the Conservation Stewardship Program. There were a lot of payments from state government or local soil and water districts up here in the darker blue, but about half said they had not received any payment whatsoever. And then this was kind of interesting, this gold slice. This is payments from private companies. Now, I would venture to say that slice has probably doubled or tripled since we did this survey, because we've seen companies like Bayer start to make cover crop payments in 10 different Midwestern states. Last year, they offered $10 an acre for plant cover crops. We're seeing other companies doing that, like General Mills. A little farther south, Wrangler is paying farmers to use cover crops with cotton. We've seen companies band together, like I think ADM worked with Target and PepsiCo, if I remember right, in Kansas to offer cover crop payments. So there's all kinds of different programs. A lot of them are in particular areas, but some are multi-state, like the Bayer program. And we'll probably see more of that with soil carbon payments like Indigo and other companies are offering. Planting green. This is one of the hottest trends in the cover crop area. It really got a rapid increase in adoption in 2019 when we had all that wet weather. Now, I happened to be in Indiana that year in May. When I work, we were visiting some farm projects we fund through the SARE program all over Indiana. So we drove from north to south and east to west across Indiana and around the third week in May. And I know everything was delayed that year. So the farmers that did have cover crops were often planting green into them. Sometimes they're doing it, it's pretty small. We'll look at this a little bit more later. But in terms of the survey, 50% said they had planted green on at least some of their fields in that year, in 2019. And I'm sure in Indiana it was probably even higher. We asked about how planting green affect your crop, cash crop management. Well, 33% or a third said it made management simpler. About another third said, well, it's about the same complexity compared to earlier termination of cover crops. There were about 20% said, well, it's a little more difficult, a little trickier to do, but they still felt the benefits outweighed the challenges, which is interesting to see. Another about 10% said, well, we're still kind of evaluating. We want to stick with this. You know, we're not sure if the benefits are worth the potential challenges. And there were only 5% that actually said it was so difficult that they didn't want to do it again. Maybe they had a bad experience with not being able to get into plant in a timely fashion. But when you compare 5% versus those that are having some positive experiences or at least feeling like it's worth doing, even if there's some slight complications, it's a pretty big difference. So what are some issues with planting green? Are there earlier season diseases or slugs or voles? You know, what happens with weeds? So we asked about that. So the blue is good. It's better when planting green. And the one that jumps out at you is the weed control. And this is no surprise, right? If you're letting the cover crop grow longer, of course, it's going to suppress the weeds better. The orange bars are folks saying, well, it's about the same. If I planted green versus terminating early, I didn't see a big difference on my farm. So about a quarter of the farmers said it wasn't that different. And then the gray says it's worse when planting green. So hardly anybody said their weed control was worse if they planted green. Now, these other pest issues or disease issues, this is more, most people are saying they're not seeing a whole lot of difference. We know with voles that can be very localized. I've seen fields in Missouri that had major vole issues, but I've seen a lot of fields that didn't have a vole at all. So it can be very localized. There's some things we can do to help with that. Slugs, we're learning that if you plant green, that can actually help with slugs because they'll keep eating the cover crop instead of eating the cash crop seedling. So that can be helpful. But, I don't want to ignore the fact there were 13% that said that the slugs seemed a little worse to them in planting green. So there can be some issues for sure, something to pay attention to if we're looking at doing that management. How about soil moisture? That's really been the big question about planting green. Is this going to dry out the soil? Well, here's what folks said. Planting green helps with soil management. About 2/3 of the farmers said that it helped with their moisture management. Now, another 20%, the next biggest fraction, said they thought it was about similar, probably referring to the 2019 year. There were only 7% that felt that, in their experience, it dried out the soil too often. And then there were a few that felt, maybe they're getting a mat of cover crop residue somehow, that it's leaving the soil too wet. But this is significant because when we first started talking about green, I worked a lot on crop insurance issues with cover crops. There was a lot of concern from the crop insurance people that, well, you can't do that because it's going to dry the field out and that's going to hurt the cash crop. I think we're finding that it's actually the opposite, that it's really a moisture management tool. Now, to be sure, in a dry year, we do need to terminate early. We don't want to let rye get 5 feet tall in a dry spring, or it can dry the field out. But we're tending to see these wetter springs in the Midwest, the climatologists are telling us, and so it can be a helpful management tool. Okay, how about the ease of planting? We're going to look at equipment here in a moment. Now, what's the situation with planting into this? So about half, a little over half, said I was actually able to plant sooner in the fields where I was planting green than in my other fields. Now, that could include conventional fields or fields with early termination. About a little over another third said that the time of planting was about the same, and just under 10% said that they planted later in their planting green field. So again, there can be issues. I don't want to make a claim that this is just always going to go perfectly, but you can see more than 5 times as many had a positive experience with planting early versus 10% saying they had a delayed experience. So that's something we're studying in more depth in a big study across the Midwest right now, but the preliminary evaluation is that in a wet year like 19, this has really helped us get into the field. So if the cover crops did delay your ability to plant, and this is not just specific to planting green, but cover crops in general here, what was going on? Well, first of all, almost 3/4 said that the cover crops were not delaying their planting. Now, again, this is not just planting green, this is all cover crop use. About 10% said they couldn't get in to spray the cover crops because the soil was too wet. So obviously that could be an issue. Another 6% said they couldn't work the field with tillage to dry it out like maybe they normally would. There were some that planted or terminated the cover crop before their intended cash crop planting date. It got to be a wet mat is what the rest of that says. But in general, most were pretty happy that they didn't have a delayed planting issue. So that's just a part of what we learned from that survey. Again, you can go online, just do a search for SARE, S-A-R-E, crop survey, and you can find all of those surveys if you want to look at some more of that information. But farmers in general, we're finding definitely a lot of benefits, as we know, to cover crops and weed control. I think we're increasingly seeing that cover crops really help with weed control in certain instances, not with every weed and not in every field, but they often are helping. And they can help with planting date. That's a big thing we saw in 2019, that the majority of farmers were saying that they were helpful for planting date, there were such yield gains and help with some profit in terms of either some reduced cost or just the benefits of the yield gains. So I want to finish up with some equipment. I know that's often a lot of our favorite topics when we're talking about our farming operations, and aerial seeding, as I said earlier, is still something that's fairly popular. And by the way, as we're looking at this picture, this is the right time to aerially seed cover crops into soybeans. If you've never attempted that, I will tell you it can be a little tricky to get the timing in aerial seeding soybeans or any broadcast seeding in soybeans, because we want to do it when the leaves are starting to turn yellow, because if the leaves are still completely green, there can be too much shading to get that cover crop established well. But if we wait too long and the leaves have all fallen on the ground, then that cover crop seed is just laying on top of a layer of soybean leaves. And without any soil contact, well, you can imagine what happens. It's just not going to germinate. or at least not grow very long, even if it does sprout. So what about other broadcast seeding? Hagie, among other companies, has made some adaptations to their high clearance spray equipment so people could broadcast cover crops. What they do is they take out the box back here and put in a seed box, and then there's an air blower added. They tell me that if somebody has one of these, a farmer or an ag retailer, or they can get that switch out in less than a day. And these machines, if you got a big enough field, 500 acres a day. Now, obviously, if you had to run seed around, it could take longer than that. But the advantage is you can go on a windier day than you can with an airplane. The advantage of the airplane is if the ground is really too wet for one of these units, then you can still get the seed on. This is another piece of Hagie equipment that was more experimental. I got to see this in operation in the field. Instead of just broadcasting the seed, actually I've got a couple types of rollers here. One is just a conventional roller, another is more of a cultipacker type thing. And they found that that did improve seed germination, especially for larger types of cover crop seed. Decided not to, they sold a few of these units, but they've decided not to market them because this toolbar is not as wide and the unit cannot go as fast. So that previous unit I showed you that's broadcasting the cover crop seed, this one can get over a lot more acres. And so Hagie has decided to push this one on the market instead of this approach. But I'm hopeful in the long run, maybe we'll have some more options like that. We're seeing an explosion of interest in vertical tillage tools. These are a couple photos from the Farm Progress Show in Central Illinois in 2019. And that's very close to where my family farm is. And I counted 9 different companies with vertical tillage machines that were demonstrating cover crop seeding equipment. And a lot of that was integrated into it, like this one, the accelerator from Kuhn. So you can see here, they've got a promotional setup talking about how this unit works. So again, there's a blower that's going to blow the seed through. Generally, these are going to put the seed, you can see these tubes up at the front of the rig. They're going to be dropping the seeds in the front. Now you do have to think about what you're seeding. That works really well for rye. If we're doing something that needs to be seeded more shallowly, like radishes, some people will switch the tubes and broadcast it in the back, but it just kind of depends on what we're trying to seed there. Here's a couple of other options, maybe not quite as common seen. Uniforth has a rolling harrow. It's kind of interesting type of rig, again, set up with a air seeder and box. This is a horse unit with another type of, different type of fall tillage instrument. So I think I counted about 15 different ways cover crop seeders were being attached to tillage equipment at that Farm Progress Show that fall 2 years ago. I mentioned the planting green is a big trend. It's fairly straightforward if we're doing it in cover crops that are 6 inches tall, like this picture, but it definitely causes a little more thought when we're doing it in a field that's 6 feet tall. And you know, some of you have probably seen photos like this, but I tell you, as an agronomist, if you had shown me this 10 years ago, I would have thought you were crazy to go out and plant soybeans into a field of rye that's 6 feet tall. But amazingly, a lot of farmers are making this work. We do have to think about our planter setup, though. One thing to know is when you do that, you don't necessarily need to have a roller crimper. The toolbar itself on the planter will knock a lot of that rye down. This is at our University of Missouri agronomy farm. We're out there kind of playing around with the planter, trying it. And what we're actually doing that day was looking at some different closing units. So we had set up the planter with a bunch of different closers. What we've learned is, you know, in clean till situations, we generally see these smooth closing wheels, either rubber or steel. But for a no-till situation, especially with cover crops, in general, we're finding that some sort of spiked wheel is generally going to work better. And what's happening is that spike doesn't have to be this one. It could be something like these over here. It tends to break down that sidewall that will be relatively firm, potentially in that no-till situation. I've had long-term no-tillers using cover crops for several years tell me their soil gets so mellow that they can use almost anything. But when you're kind of first switching to the system, you may find you need a spiked wheel. Now, some farmers will do this approach. They'll have one smooth wheel and one spiked wheel. A lot of them will put 2 spiked wheels on, but something to experiment with for your situation. Now, this is interesting. Steve Groff, some of you may have heard of, a well-known farmer, cover crop user from Pennsylvania who's traveled all over the world speaking about cover crops. He started seeing a few years back these closing angles. So he started talking to some manufacturers here, and sure enough, you can now get these here in the US. So here's an adjustable one. And the idea is because you don't have that clean till situation, you just need maybe a little ability to adjust the angle of those closing wheels to get good closing. So that's just kind of a look at some of the trends that are happening. Again, there's lots of innovation with equipment. We're seeing new varieties of cover crops, some new species being used. Black oats is a really interesting one for fall cover crop use. We're seeing even strange things like Ethiopian cabbage. I would say more farmers are doing cover crop mixes as they get experience, and definitely more are planting green. Now, if you're a first-time cover crop user, I'd be a little careful with jumping into that wholeheartedly, but maybe try it on a field, get some experience with planting green. But it can be a good approach as people get some experience. So we're certainly seeing lots of soil health benefits, and we continue to learn about those, including impacts on mycorrhizal fungi and other things. So I will wrap up there, but be happy to entertain any questions.
My name is Bill Johnson, and in this presentation, what I want to do is cover some information related to cover crops and weed suppression. Recently, there's been a lot more interest in growing cover crops, particularly here in the Eastern Corn Belt. And one of the challenges has been a lot of information from the people that supply seed and equipment and some of the services related to cover crops claiming that there were excessive weed control benefits provided by cover crops. And so one of the things that I wanted to do is share some information about the philosophy of weed control with cover crops and provide some information to users that came from a research that we have done here at Purdue University. So most weed scientists, people like myself, think of cover crops as another cultural weed management tool. Very similar to how we would treat tillage, crop rotation, or weed seed bank management. It's basically an additional tool that we can use to control weeds. It's not the be-all, end-all, but certainly can be used to help some of our other weed management tactics. There are some species of cover crops that are very good at suppressing weeds. There are some species that really don't offer us much weed control benefit. And the purpose of this presentation is to review data from Indiana generated in our research program so we can provide you a more educated answer to questions regarding weed control and cover crops. There are a number of ways that weeds are controlled by cover crops. And on this slide and the next one, I have a list of the different types of control that we can get from cover crops. You know, certainly competition is pretty easy to see when we look at some of the high biomass cover crops. It's competing with the weed for space, nutrients, light, and interfering with the growth. You know, the physical suppression of a mulch layer, and the seed has to generate enough energy to push through that mulch layer. So I think competition and physical suppression are certainly the two most important ones that we rely on with our high biomass cover crops. Allelopathy, there are some cover crops such as forage radish and cereal rye which can release chemical compounds to inhibit weed growth. However, this is fairly unpredictable, and basically we can't manage it. So when it happens, it's great, but again, it's not something that's nearly as reliable as the competition and physical suppression. The physical or chemical process of terminating the cover crops is also another weed control tactic that will help to suppress some of the weeds that are growing in the cover crop at the time that it is terminated, and if we use a residual herbicide with our chemical program, we can get some residual control of weeds in our cover crop as well. Now, another thing that the cover crop does is, much like a crop like corn or soybeans that grows in the summer, it alters the soil moisture, temperature, and light reaching the soil surface, which creates a different environment for the weeds, and that can result in some weed suppression as well. Cover crops can also serve as a place where weed seed predators can and pathogens can live as well, and so that can help with weed suppression provided by cover crops. This diagram here shows the weed life cycle. The brown denotes life cycle stages that take place in the soil, and then the blue denotes basically life cycle stages that take place once the weed has emerged. And you'll notice on the left-hand side here, we have different symbols associated with the different aspects of weed suppression that we talked about on the previous couple of slides. And so if we go back to this circular diagram, basically what we see here is that within each of these weed life stages, you can see which of the weed suppressive aspects of cover crops might be more likely to take place. So for example, when the weed is germinating, you could have allelopathy taking place, you could have physical suppression provided by the mulch, and you could also have a change in the microenvironment happening that could have a negative impact on weed seed germination. Now that doesn't mean all of these things will take place, but those are the potential things that can take place. And so I think the key takeaway message from this diagram here is that if you look at the most vulnerable stages of a weed's life cycle, you'll see that germination, the white thread stage, and the seedling stage are probably where competition and physical suppression are going to play a bigger role. And so that's where you're most likely to get the positive benefits of weed suppression from a cover crop. Now, I got a couple of data slides I want to show you here, and first we're going to focus on winter annual weeds. And so we did some long-term studies back in the early 2000s, and in these studies we were essentially looking at cover crops as a way not only to suppress winter annual weeds, but also how they impacted soybean cyst nematode as well, because there was some information floating around at that time that annual ryegrass was suppressive to soybean cyst nematode. So we ran these experiments for 5 years, and essentially what I'm doing here is I'm showing you some of the data from years 1, 2, and 3, and the early impact of cover crops on winter annual weed densities. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you some data from the seed bank that's a summarization of 5 years. So I really want to focus just here on this bottom data set that I've got highlighted by the box. So we have 4 treatments here that we evaluated, and what we're looking at here is the density in the spring just prior to termination. So again, we're looking at everything that made it through the winter and that had the opportunity to be suppressed by a cover crop. So in our non-treated check, our densities, so we had 2 different sites, West Lafayette and also Vincennes. At Vincennes, we had a higher winter annual weed population, and that's going to be a slightly warmer environment as well. West Lafayette, a cooler environment and lower densities of winter annual weeds. So what you can see here, here's our non-treated check, and our densities were 12, 5, and 24 in the spring of 4, 5, and 6 respectively. At Vincennes, our densities were quite a bit higher, 127, 118, and 199. If we look at a fall applied herbicide, you can see our densities are 3, 1, and 0. Fall seeded annual ryegrass, our densities were 4, 9, and 37. And fall seeded wheat was 2, 3, and 11. At the Vincennes site, kind of a similar story. Our fall applied herbicide was more effective than our cover crops at suppressing weeds. But again, really what we want to do is we want to compare the weed densities back to the non-treated check. And we did see at Vincennes that we got some suppression of our winter annual weeds in this third year here. We didn't really see much of an impact the first year. The second year, the annual ryegrass seemed to give us some suppression, but the wheat didn't. And then again, by the time we got to the third year, we saw some weed suppression by both of the cover crops compared to the non-treated check, but still falling a little bit behind what we would have for our fall applied herbicide. When we go back to the Lafayette data, or the West Lafayette data, we really, with these low densities, we saw a little bit of weed suppression with wheat, none with annual ryegrass, and again, both of them were a little bit less than what we saw with the fall applied herbicide. So again, those were spring densities; those were in-field spring densities. If we take a look at at what's in the seed bank after 5 years. So again, one of the criticisms we frequently listen to is that the fact that it takes a long time for these cover crops to have their impact. So this was after 5 years. So the treatments are broken up a little bit differently here. So here's our non-treated check. Here's a fall herbicide, spring herbicide, fall plus spring herbicide, and then wheat, fall seeded wheat, and fall seeded annual ryegrass. And so after 5 years, here's the number of weed seedlings in the soil samples. So again, our non-treated check is 30. Our herbicide treatments are down in the single digits. And then our fall wheat was lower than our non-treated check, but our fall annual ryegrass was about the same as our non-treated check. If we go to the Vincennes site, where again the weed densities are a little bit higher and the environment's warmer, here's our non-treated check. Here's our fall herbicide, spring herbicide, fall plus spring herbicide, and then our cover crops. So our cover crops really did not reduce the seedling density in the weed seed bank at this site, which was again warmer and had higher densities of weeds. And again, our herbicides were doing a better job. One of the very reliable things about cereal rye as a cover crop is its ability to suppress horseweed emergence and size. Here's a picture from some of our plots at CPAC, and on the left-hand side you can see an area that didn't have a cover crop growing in it, and on the right-hand side you can see an area that had cereal rye. And although it's kind of hard to pick up, the horseweed is much smaller and less dense in the cereal rye than it is in the area with no cover crop. If we go into these plots and harvest a couple of representative plants, you can see what we're talking about here. The area on the left did not have a cover crop growing in the area, and the plants on the right can show the suppression that you get of horseweed by cereal rye. So again, the ability of cereal rye to suppress horseweed is one of the areas that's fairly reliable and is a good management strategy for this particular weed. So to summarize some of our information on horseweed management, and again, I just showed you a couple of pictures here because again, this is fairly reliable and I don't think we need to show a lot of data on this. There's no question whatsoever that rye and also wheat, any kind of a grass cover crop that produces a lot of biomass can reduce horseweed density and size. In some of the work that I've done and reviewed, the seeding rate really doesn't matter all that much. It's really more dependent on getting the cover crop established in the fall so it can compete with the horseweed that's germinating in the fall. And then if you have that ground cover in the spring, that essentially prevents the horseweed from germinating in the spring. So again, to kind of finalize this, this is probably the most consistent or reliable weed response to a cover crop that we are aware of to date in terms of our winter annual weeds. So to summarize our research on winter annual weeds, it's mostly NS as far as the cover crops reducing winter annual weed densities for every species other than horseweed or mare's tail. Horseweed or mare's tail is very reliable. All the others are basically not significant. Suppression of the size and density of horseweed is again observed with high biomass cereal rye. And then when you combine the cover crop termination herbicides with the cover crop, that is a great approach to driving down the densities of winter annuals. But again, you've got to be selective on the herbicides that you're using to control the winter annuals. You simply can't go out there with glyphosate and expect that to be the be-all end-all. You have to be a little bit more sophisticated than that. So that concludes the information on the winter annual weed suppression by cover crops. So the next thing I want to discuss then are summer annual weeds and how do cover crops suppress summer annual weeds. So again, I think the big thing to think about here is if biomass production results in a mulch layer and physical suppression, how much is this going to impact summer annual weeds when the summer annual weeds are basically growing at a different time of the year compared to the winter annual weeds? And then, another question too is how do we integrate herbicides with our cover crops? So in terms of our cover crop information, we need to think hard about the species, and obviously we want to, much like we do with horseweed, we want high biomass cover crops in order to utilize that mulch or that physical suppression. In terms of the weeds that are going to be most likely to be suppressed by cover crops, it's going to be the small seeded annual weeds that require light for germination. So if our cover crop can reduce the amount of light that hits the soil surface, they're more likely to have an impact on weed seed germination. We know that cover crops are not going to be hugely effective on perennials and some of the large seeded annual weeds that have that energy supply to be able to push up through the residue. And also those perennials and large seeded annuals typically don't have requirements to break dormancy. So again, I think our best opportunity to suppress weeds is going to be the early emerging spring annual type of weeds. All right, the cover crop establishment and termination timing can impact this as well. And certainly, there's a lot of interest in terminating as late as we can to maximize the benefits of the cover crops, but this can lead to some challenges with crop yields, and I'll show you some of that data as well. Now, to begin this discussion, I wanted to show you this piece of information here. And so basically what this shows you is that I've got six different site years here over 6 different soybean trials, and I've plotted the early season weed biomass. So this weed biomass was collected when we did the termination, and we've plotted that as a function of cover crop biomass. And so what you see here, when our cover crop biomass is relatively low, 0 to about 2,500 pounds, you see a lot of noise in this data. Sometimes you're getting some weed suppression, sometimes you're not getting some weed suppression. But once we get to about 2,500 pounds of cover crop biomass, what you can see here is a much more reliable ability of the cover crop to suppress weeds. So again, kind of keep that 2,500 pounds in mind is where we're getting some more consistent or reliable suppression of weeds, of summer annual weeds by cover crops. Okay, a couple more data sets to show you here. So again, these are from Soybean Experiments, and we had a series of experiments at 3 different sites where we looked at termination timing, before planting, at planting, or after planting. And then we also looked at some different types of cover crops, cereal rye alone, cereal rye with crimson clover, and then a crimson clover alone. And the reason we looked at crimson clover alone is to look at something that's not a high biomass producer to kind of evaluate what that would look like. So here is the cover crop biomass prior to termination, and as you might expect, when you delay the termination timing, whether it was in 2018 or 2019, you get an increase in the amount of biomass. Now, you get a pretty significant increase in biomass when you go from 2 weeks before to at planting, but at planting to 2 weeks after, you really don't see a significant increase in biomass. And some of that could be due to the fact that the cover crop has entered the reproductive stage of growth, and some of it could be due to the fact that you're running over the cover crop with the planting equipment, and the cover crop has to recover from that mechanical damage. Now, if we take a look at the weed biomass as a function of termination timing, what you can see here is, again, the amount of biomass influences the amount of weed suppression. So your low biomass crimson clover gives you the highest amount of weed biomass. So that kind of stands to reason. If we take a look at the cereal rye versus a cereal rye plus crimson clover, we don't see a lot of difference. We don't see any difference there. But again, I think it kind of supports our initial thoughts that the more biomass that you have, the more weed suppression that you get. So again, remember we said we wanted to be up here at about 2,500 pounds or greater to get significant weed suppression. And then again, what you see here is you see some significant differences in weed suppression in 2018 when you delayed the termination timing from at planting to after planting. And in 19, you really didn't see a difference across those termination timings. So again, that was 6 different site years. So that's pooled across all of the weed species that were prevalent in these soybean trials. If we focus just on water hemp, okay, we're going to focus on water hemp at one site year. So at CPAC, actually this was 2 site years at CPAC. What you can see here is that our termination, we had a really early termination timing because we tend to get rainfall events down there that delay some of our other operations. And if we break this out by herbicide program, so here's our most aggressive herbicide program, glyphosate with an auxin herbicide and a residual herbicide, versus glyphosate and an auxin where we've taken the residual out and glyphosate alone. What you can see is that our water hemp biomass with the early termination timing is less with a more aggressive residual herbicide program. But as we have delayed that termination timing, you can see that we get better water hemp suppression as we delay that termination timing to at planting and after planting. Now, we don't see an added benefit of delaying it till after planting, but you can certainly see here our best overall treatments were to terminate at planting with an aggressive herbicide program in terms of suppressing water hemp. But even if you look at just glyphosate alone with no auxin and no residual, certainly you're getting better control there than you are by terminating early. But again, if we really want to drive the population of this weed down, we have to terminate early with an aggressive herbicide program. Okay, so our summary of summer annual weed control in soybean with cereal rye or cereal rye plus crimson clover, terminating at or after planting was beneficial in reducing not only water hemp, but also grass, horseweed, and horseweed. However, it did not reduce giant ragweed. Now, in terms of that late termination timing, we saw yield reductions of anywhere from 14 to 40% at about half of our site years. So half of our site years, no impact on soybean yield. Half of our site years, we did see a significant reduction. So this is why with soybeans, again, there is some yield loss penalty that will happen once in a while. So we still think that termination at planting is going to be the safest approach. It's going to give you the best. It's going to give you the best weed suppression, and it's going to give you the least amount of risk in terms of reducing crop yield. Okay, so practical implications. Again, we go back to high biomass, helps to suppress horseweed. Early seeding and later termination will be more beneficial because of the biomass production. And again, if you have residues that decompose slowly, those are going to extend that residual window. Low residue biomass. With low residue biomass, you really have to be more aggressive with your herbicide program because you're putting more emphasis on that herbicide program to suppress the weeds. All right, what about cover crops and weed suppression in corn? So we talked about soybeans, now we want to talk about corn. So corn's a little bit of a different animal because historically corn is much more sensitive to early season weed competition. And so these delayed termination timings, terminating after planting, makes me a nervous wreck as a weed scientist because I've done so many weed competition studies and I know how sensitive corn is to early season weed competition. So we're going to show some data from our corn experiments. And again, these are relatively recent. So this is, again, 6 site years. And these are organized a little bit differently. So the blue bar denotes our termination timings, which occurred 2 to 3 weeks before planting. The dark blue bar is at planting, and then the gray bar is 2 to 3 weeks after planting. So here's our cover crop biomass. So again, as we delay termination, we get greater amounts of cover crop biomass. So that's very consistent with what we've seen in our soybean experiments. A significant difference from 2 to 3 weeks before planting to at planting, but not really a highly significant difference by delaying it till after planting. In terms of the weed biomass, we collected weed biomass basically at the time when we would make the post treatment. So that's kind of a function of what your cover crop was able to provide you. So as we delayed that termination timing, we had less weed biomass in the plot. So that's a good thing, less weed biomass that we're exposing our post-emerge herbicides to. But then when we take a look at crop yield, you see this trend here where the yields are trending downward as you delay that termination timing. Now again, there's enough noise in this data where that was not statistically significant, but I'm going to parse out some of these individual sites on following slides and go through that with you so you can kind of understand where that happens. Okay, so here is the cover crop biomass and the weed biomass broken out by the different sites. So I've got 2 site years at each of these locations. So TPAC is west central Indiana. Here's our cover crop biomass when we terminated before planting, cover crop biomass terminated at planting, weed biomass from our early termination, and weed biomass from our late termination. So this kind of follows the trend that we would expect. Delay termination, you get more cover crop biomass. When you get more cover crop biomass, you see a decrease in your weed biomass. So that was TPAC, West Central. Okay, Davis is East Central Indiana. So again, kind of the same trend here, a little bit less dramatic. So increase in biomass, cover crop biomass as you delay termination timing. And then the weed biomass saw a slight decrease, or a decrease that tended to be trending downward. At CPAC, which is in southeast Indiana, much higher amounts of biomass by the cover crop that were produced. So again, we saw this characteristic increase as we delayed termination timing, and then again a decrease in weed biomass as we delayed that termination timing as well. So again, TPAC and CPAC, fairly well understood interaction here. At our warmer location, we get more cover crop biomass, and then we see a greater impact on the weed biomass. And in Davis, just if you hold your mouth right, you can say you can kind of see the same impact there, but not quite as significant as we would see at either our high yielding site or our southern site. Now, what about suppression of weeds? Remember, we talked about in soybeans, we do not get suppression of giant ragweed in soybeans. Okay, in corn, we do get a little bit of suppression of giant ragweed in corn that we don't get in soybeans. So I'm not sure I quite understand that yet. It might have something to do with nitrogen. But anyway, if we take a look at our annual grasses, we see a significant decrease in annual grass density when we go from terminating before planting to terminating at planting. We see the same thing with giant ragweed, and we see a pretty significant impact on water hemp. So again, delaying that termination timing from at planting, or excuse me, from before planting to at planting gives us more biomass, and it helps to suppress our weed densities. Okay, what about corn yields? So again, we're just going to show here this terminated before planting versus terminated at planting. So what you see here is really at TPAC over 2 site years, you don't see a difference between the two. At Davis, again, you don't see a significant difference between the two. And then at CPAC, which was our lower yielding site, you see a trend that's going in the wrong direction. It's not statistically significant, but again, those type of trends do make you a little bit nervous. So I think to summarize that data, again, in corn, we tend to get some decent weed suppression by delaying the termination timing to at planting. Delaying it to after planting makes me nervous because of the yield loss potential. All right, the next topic I want to talk about then is weed suppression by cover crops as it's related to the cover crop termination operation. So there's a number of different ways that cover crops are terminated. It all depends on whether you're organic or traditional chemical control, whether or not you're using some crimpers or things like that. But again, any operation done to terminate the cover crop usually has an impact on the weeds that are in the cover crop. And if you use residual herbicides or you provide a good mulch, it can have some residual effects on the weeds that come up later in the year. So again, one way it's killed is by winter kill. Typically, cover crops that winter kill don't provide quite as much weed suppression because essentially they're open ground in the spring and not nearly as much biomass is produced. Now, in terms of mechanical, we've got mowing, we've got tillage, and we could also throw the crimping in there as well. I'll talk a little bit about crimping in a few different slides. And then our chemical operations are again pretty typical for our no-till systems. I know with the popularity of cereal rye, a lot of guys want to use just glyphosate to terminate that, and that's okay as long as you don't have populations of weeds that are resistant to glyphosate herbicide. So a couple of key things to keep in mind in terms of chemical control. Remember that most of our cover crops can be terminated with herbicides, but you want the cover crops actively growing in order for the herbicides to be most effective. A weed that's actively growing is going to be much easier to kill with a herbicide than one that's stressed by drought, cold temperatures, or cloudy weather. Application timing is pretty important for some. For most of our cover crops, once they start producing seed heads, they're very difficult to kill with herbicides. You might be able to do it with things like crimpers when they have seed heads, but it's very difficult with a herbicide. And then again, remember that really cold temperatures and cloudy days impact the ability of the herbicide to work properly. So if at all possible, always try to spray on a nice warm sunny day after you've had a couple of warmer days in order to help get that plant reactivated and growing. And there's a lot of good resources that you can consult for terminating your cover crops and also understanding the herbicides that can provide some control of the weeds that you have in crop as well. This is a page out of our weed control guide where we talk about burn down herbicides. And you can see we've got things in here like red clover. We've also got alfalfa, vetch, and things like that in here. So as far as terminating those type of cover crops and the herbicide programs to choose, and then what you can do to get additional control of your weeds, almost every state is going to have a guide like this where you can parse out that information. So we've also produced some individual publications on things like annual ryegrass. At one time, about 7 or 8 years ago, there was a lot of interest in utilizing annual ryegrass as a cover crop. Hopefully we've talked people out of that, because that one's just got a lot of things to consider. It's tougher to terminate. It doesn't really provide great weed suppression. And then it is, one of our worst herbicide resistant weeds if we get some biotypes in here that have glyphosate or ACCase resistance. But again, things like that are available out there. The Midwest Cover Crops website has some information on terminating cover crops as well. Okay, let's finish off our discussion then with a little bit of information on the roller crimper. So roller crimper, particularly in the eastern corn belt here, where we're utilizing a lot of cereal rye, is a pretty important tool. Again, the key is to hit it at the anthesis growing stage. A lot of interest from organic farmers, but we also have some people now that are experimenting with interseeding or with utilizing balenza clover with cereal rye. Balenza clover can provide some nitrogen, and since it has a hollow stem, it also makes it fairly easy to terminate with a roller crimper as well. So here's some different ways that roller crimper can be used. So here's a front mounted in operation. Some of the companies now that produce planting equipment are also producing these roller crimpers that can be mounted underneath the main bar of your planter. Here's one here, somewhat small rollers mounted on this John Deere planter, and then he's got a hydraulic downforce system on here in order to get the appropriate amount of down pressure. And then here's another picture of operations like that. This unit, here's the unit on the left here that doesn't have the row cleaners mounted in front of it, and here's the unit on the right that does have some row cleaners mounted in front of it, and you can kind of see the difference in what you get out of those two operations there as well. The big key with these planters here is making sure that you call the company and understand whether or not the particular planter that you have is capable to be outfitted with these. I've done a little bit of work on these things, and it essentially looks like there's some planters that it works pretty well with, but you got to make sure you've got enough weight on that planter to be able to crush the cereal rye and also make some of the other parts of the planter work as well. All right, to summarize the presentation, again, we know cover crops are useful for many different reasons. Weed control we view as an extra benefit. It's considered to be one of the small hammers, and like I mentioned earlier, one of our reasons for doing this was that we just felt like there were some claims made about the weed control benefits provided by cover crops that were unfounded. But I think if people will think of these things as a selective herbicide, and they sort of understand the management around it for specific weeds, and they're going to be successful with it. Again, the physical suppression provided by the biomass is kind of the main thing that we think is fairly reliable. So if you have that, if you can get that 2,500 pounds or more of biomass and not delay the termination too terribly long, where it creates competition in the summertime, that's going to be an opportunity to have the most success for something like this. So again, be thinking about the specific weeds that you want to suppress. So if you have some problematic weeds that you're treating with herbicides and it interferes with cover crop establishment in the fall, there are ways to think this through and manage around it. And it could be such that there are some fields that are very well suited for cover crops just based on the problematic weeds that it has. There could be other fields where the cover crop's not going to do you any good, and so it does require some thought in order to kind of make that whole system fit into your operation. Okay, I think that's all I have for this presentation.
And one of those includes grain that's not intended for seeding or sowing purposes. So in other words, not commercial grain. So it could be wheat, it could be rye that's not going to be used for commercial use. It's not going to be harvested. And then seed that satisfies all of the following requirements. So the seed would have to be grown on the property of the person that's going to be selling the seed. And then when it's sold and delivered directly to the purchaser on the property where it's going to be grown. So you can sell it to your neighbor for use as a cover crop, but you can't buy it from somebody else who grew it on their farm and sell it to your neighbor, if that makes sense. And then also the seed cannot have weed seeds that are classified as noxious or exceed the maximum of 2.5% of all the seed. And so this has always been known as the farmer exemption. And so it's something that allows you to help out your neighbor by selling some seed to your neighbor. But again, it's not something where you can retail seed without a license. And so there's several conditions that void the farmer exemption. If you advertise it, then that voids the farmer exemption. So you have to be licensed, and that seed has to be licensed in order for you to sell it if you're going to advertise it. So your neighbor can come to you and say, hey, do you have some seed that I can use to plant this field of cover crops? And you say, sure, yeah, I have some. I'll sell it to you. You can't go out on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist and advertise cover crop seed for sale. That's going to void the farmer exemption. You can't sell it higher than the current market price. So if Superior Ag is selling a bag of cereal rye for 30 bucks, you can't charge your neighbor 45 bucks for the same weight of cereal rye. And again, you can't go from somebody else's farm. You can't go down the road and buy cereal rye from another farmer and then sell it to your neighbor. That's going to void the farmer exemption. Now let's talk about some of the weeds. So the vast majority of the cover crop seed in Indiana is clean and has a good germination level. It's been tested by the seed division of the Indiana State Chemist's Office. But rye, which is one of our most important cover crops, has had some issues with weeds. And a lot of that is due to this locally grown seed that hasn't been managed as a seed crop. So again, you planted rye as a cover crop, it went to seed, you decide to harvest the seeds and just use it for more cover crop seed. And so that tends to have a higher weed count than rye that was specifically grown as a seed crop. And so if you have your rye goes too long, say I need to get something out of this since I'm not getting my planting in the way I want it to, you're not going to have the same, you won't necessarily take the same care to keep that seed free from weeds as somebody that's specifically looking at a seed crop. And then, you may have some local growers that are raising it as a seed crop, but they're not raising it well. That's a minority of seed growers. Typically, professionally grown rye seed is going to be a lot cleaner than what you can get from your neighbor. But the only issue that we see with this seed is that sometimes they'll make germination claims that are too high compared to the actual germination. For instance, they claimed 90% germination, and it should have been 85% that they claimed. And so there are a couple of different terminologies that we need to use. So official samples are those pulled by an Office of the Indiana State Chemist Inspector. And that would be from a place of business or somebody who's producing that seed for retail sales. Or somebody who is a retailer. Or it could be you suspect that the seed that you got is not what is stated on the label. So official sample would be pulled by the State Chemist's Office for testing. And so this testing, or this type of sample, is statistically significant because they have consistency in their methodology. They have consistency in the lot size that they use. They have consistency in the way they divide the seed, etc. So that consistency is what makes it statistically significant. Service samples, on the other hand, would be a sample that you you might send out of a batch of seed that you have in your, in your storage building, that you want to make sure that there aren't noxious weed seeds in here before you use it. And so you may send it off, or the seed company may send it off to get some information about it. But it's not going to be statistically significant, because you're going to have inconsistent methodology in sampling that seed. And so it may give you some good information, but it's not something that you can use to label a bag of seed. And so here's an example of what we've seen from the state chemist's office, what they found in their testing. So about 32% of their official rye samples have failed the testing. That was in 2018, or 2018, I mean. So the failures were mostly due to lower germination than the claims on the label. And then about 10% of it was due to weed seeds. And so in 2018, we saw an average germination of 83.27%, and it might have been labeled 90%. And so in general, that's going to be your main source of failure, is people are they're assuming a germination before they're actually testing it. So the weeds that were seen in 2018 were amaranth, poison hemlock, quackgrass, wild garlic, Johnson grass, and others. None of these are things that you want to be seeding into your fields, particularly your amaranths, which are a little bit more difficult to kill. And so in general, you had a pretty high, you had pretty high average germination, but again, you had a lot of samples with weeds and with insects in them. And the question, does it matter where the seed is grown? Well, in a 2017 study, we saw that there were, some parts of the state had higher germination than others. So southern Indiana grown rye tended to have a lower germination than northern Indiana grown rye. And we're talking about rye that was grown on one farm and then used, either on the same farm or on a neighboring farm. And then compared to professionally grown rye, which is going to have the highest germination rate. And so that's your source. This is, again, it's grown specifically for seed. And so it's going to be a cleaner source of seed, and it's going to have more quality control. 23% of all the locally grown rye had between 50% germination. So again, it's buyer beware if you're getting something that's not licensed and labeled. It may be cheaper, but again, buyer beware. You're going to have a higher chance of weed seeds, and you're going to likely have a lower germination rate. Not always, but locally. So is professional grown seed always great? Not always, but normally it's pretty good, because somebody who's growing seed professionally is maintaining a certain quality standard in order to stay in business. The sample in the Indiana State Chemist's Office test from professionally grown seed that had the highest number of weed seeds had 10 different species of weeds. And so that's a lot of weeds. It's not that many compared to some of what we see with locally grown. And then, so the weed seeds of the year that they saw most commonly: corn cockle in 2016, quackgrass 2017, 2018, wild garlic, curl dock, and amaranth. And so we can see amaranth is getting to be more of a problem. So how do you test your seed? If you are getting seed from your neighbor especially, and it doesn't already have a test on it. So you want to pull a representative sample from your bag. So you want to sample 10% plus 5 bags. So if you have 20 bags, you're going to pull 2 bags plus 5 bags for 7 bags total. If you have 100 bags, then you're looking at 10 plus 5, so that's 15 bags total. And so that's how you get that representative sample. And so you want a full quart-size zipper bag, and then you're going to use a form at the State Chemist's Office website to get your submission information. You don't want to wait until the last minute. The average sample test time can be over 3 weeks, so you need to make sure that you do it in plenty of time before planting. And so February to April and August to October, those are kind of the big busy times at the state chemist's office. So you want to add a week to 10 days if you're going to be submitting samples at that time of year. And so this is what the report's going to look like that you're going to get back. And so in this report, you're going to see what's examined. You'll see the purity, the purity of the seed. So it'll give you the percentage purity. It'll give you the germination, what's claimed and what's found. The germination percentage, what's claimed and what's found. And then it'll tell you what percentage is crop seed, what percentage is inert matter, and what percentage is weed seed. So crop seed would be, so if you have cereal rye and you have some corn or some soybeans mixed in with that, that's crop seed. Inert matter that's going to be rocks, dirt, etc. Just kind of things that aren't going to make a difference. And then weed seed is the most important thing on this. How much weed seed is in this report? And while there may not be a lot of weed seed in this particular sample, it had 2 different species of noxious weed in it, and so it failed the test. It failed to pass. It failed to get approval to sell this seed because of the noxious weed content. So that is the most important thing on this entire report, is whether or not there's noxious weed. Noxious weeds are going to, that's what's going to cause the most problems with your field if you're using this as a cover crop. And so if it has prohibited weed seeds, then you can't sell it. And so this particular sample batch had to be destroyed because of the prohibited weed seeds. And so they also looked at organic seed in 16 to 17. So in general, the professionally grown organic seed looked pretty good. You didn't have a whole lot of weed seeds. It was, and this is talking to, corn and beans. So the organic corn and beans had similar weed seed content to the other corn and bean seeds. When they looked at the locally grown organic seeds, it wasn't a small sample size. They had a high rate of noxious weed seeds. 2 years in a row. They had 14 weed seeds per sample average. And so that was up from 11. So that's a lot higher number of weed seeds than we saw on average with other types. The small seeds are harder to clean. So if you are planting a cover crop seed such as clover, that's going to be a small seed, then you have a higher chance of having those weed seeds in there because they're harder to clean. And so a lot of times the locally grown organic seed didn't have the germination that was claimed, or in many cases that they suspected the seed hadn't been cleaned at all.
For most of you, this has probably been, or probably is, a familiar topic. At least you've heard about Field Watch and Driftwatch, if not having used it in the past. But just to kind of review, Driftwatch is an online registry tool that's been set up. It's a free service. It allows applicators it allows applicators and growers of specialty crops to be able to better communicate about where those specialty crops are located. So it's an online registry tool. Pesticide applicators can use it to help identify areas where specialty crops are being grown, and growers can use it to register their sites so that applicators are aware where those sites are. So why do we want to focus on the use of Driftwatch? Like I said, it's not a required program. It's free, but there definitely are some benefits. And one of those, of course, is that we all know drift is expensive. And in fact, depending on the type of crop that gets drifted on, it can be very expensive. And of course, that's no secret to anybody, I don't think. One of the other big reasons here recently is that there are now certain labels, product labels, that require you to check the Driftwatch website for specialty crops in an area where you're planning to make an application. And then you're required to document those document in your record keeping that you checked that site. And again, it's just a better way to increase the communication between you as an applicator and your neighbors who may have these sensitive crops, or as we'll look at here in a little bit, beehives and other sensitive locations like that. So we want to spend most of our time in the next 15 minutes or so looking at some of the new additions. We've covered this topic in previous PARP sessions, but since 2019, 2020, there's been a couple new additions to the site. So first of all, DNR, Department of Natural Resource sites, certain sensitive sites around the state have been added to the registry. So you as an applicator now, when you pull up the site, you'll be able to go on and there will be certain DNR sites registered. They have to be contiguous or border a agricultural area, but there are now sensitive DNR sites located on that map. The second new addition then is hemp. Hemp is now one of the listed crops you can register as a site on the Driftwatch website. So, we all know hemp now is an approved crop in Indiana. So that is an addition there to the site. Next then, we've had two new apps that have been developed that go along with the FieldWatch website. Both of these allow you to download on your phone or your mobile device to be able to better access the program, the website. So you can access the maps, access your information, on the go as you're making applications. So both of these new apps are available. The first one is the Field Check app. So that is for applicators and growers. Both can use that one. Like I said, for applicators, you can use it as you're traveling, as you're driving to locations to check. We'll talk a little bit more about notifications here in a little bit, but you can set up the app so you get notifications on your phone when new sites have been added in your area that you're watching. The other one then is the Bee Check. This is for beekeepers. Beekeeping, beehives are one of the things you can register on the site. So this one was developed specifically for beekeepers because many commercial beekeepers will move their hives quite often, and it allows them an easy way to change their locations as they move those hives. Both of these are available for free, and they're both available in both Apple and Android formats. So you can, wherever you download your apps, you can find them on there. Another big change with Driftwatch and the FieldWatch program is the addition of the crop check section of the website. Historically, the crops were always, specialty crops, so fruits and vegetables, Christmas trees, nursery crops, those kind of things. But they've added a new section of the site now where row crop producers can register sites on the sites, so that applicators can see, where they are. So, if you're growing organically, if you're growing non-dicamba resistant soybeans, you can register those sites on here as well. So that's a new addition since 2019. Another addition then, they now have a membership option. So for most, grower applicators, this isn't going to be something that's going to be of interest to you, but for larger operations or, larger companies, the local co-ops and things that use Driftwatch quite often, you can actually pay a membership and be able to gain a little more access to the maps. You can actually download the maps with this membership. They'll incorporate into your equipment software. You can make annotations on the maps and things like that. So that's an added feature. All the original things that were part of the site are still free, but this membership option is a new added feature that is available as well. So just kind of some review of the site and how to get signed up. This is an image of Indiana on the Driftwatch site. So this is what you see when you go to the site. And all those little dots there are areas, sites that have been registered around the state. So you can see, quite a few areas, a lot of beehives, the yellow markers with the bee there, a lot of other different sites. And you can see on the left-hand side of the screen then all the different options that are available to register. So as you're using the map, this is what it looks like when you go to the site. Anybody can go on and view this map. You can zoom in, you can zoom out. You can sort by the left-hand side of the screen by clicking the sites that you want to see. But as of the time this image was taken, that was the total number of sites registered in Indiana. So like I said, you can zoom in and you can actually click on those individual markers and get more information about that specific site. So you can get information about what types of crops are grown there, how they're grown, are they organic, are they conventionally grown? You can get the contact information for the grower if you need to contact them. So that information, when you zoom in and click on those links, that's the information that you can get. Like I said, it's a free service. The website is just in.driftwatch.org. And when you go to that address, this is what comes up. And to register, you can register either as a grower, as a beekeeper, or as an applicator. And those areas there are down on the bottom right corner here of the screen. So depending on what you're wanting to register, you would click on one of those 4 items to register. So Driftwatch is if you're a grower of specialty crops, that's what you would register with. If you're a beekeeper, the bee check is where you would go. The crop check is for the row crop producers registering row crop sites. And the field check is for applicators. If you're wanting to use the site to find these sensitive sites and get notifications about when new ones are added, that's where you would register. It is limited to commercial growers. So they don't allow just a home gardener to register their own vegetable garden. It's got to be crops that are grown to be sold, crops for sale. The only exception is hobbyist beekeepers are allowed to enter their sites on here. So commercial and hobbyist beekeepers, but any other hobbyist, home gardener cannot register their garden on the site. So when you click on the area to sign up, it's just pretty well standard like any other site you go to set up login information. You set a login and password. It does have an option if you don't have an email address. There's an email you can enter in there. I would recommend entering an email address if you have one though, because that's how they send updates. They'll send you a yearly update to update your registered sites if you're a grower. So I would recommend that because that's the easiest way for them to contact you. But you set that up. And then once you've done that, it takes you to this page for both producers and applicators, and it'll just ask you for this standard contact information so that they have that on the site. Then as an applicator, it'll give you the option to sign up for what type of notifications you'd like to receive. So anytime a grower adds a site, you can get notifications about that. So you have the option up there to either enter the entire state. I probably wouldn't recommend that unless you are working in the entire state, because you'll get a notification every time somebody in the whole state of Indiana registers a site. But you also then have the option to select certain counties. So if you work in a couple counties or multiple counties, you can select specific counties, or you can draw on the map specific geographic regions as well in which to receive notifications. And you can get those email or those notifications by email as well. As a producer, if you're registering as a grower of specialty crops or a beekeeper or a row crop grower, It'll take you to this page and have a drop-down menu there for you to complete the information about your crops. You'll then have the option to go in and highlight the area on the aerial map of your actual field or your location where you're growing those crops or where your beehives are located. So there's a trace button up at the top of the screen. And then just like any other mapping software, you can go in and form just the boundaries of that location. So if this is a field here, that's been marked on the site. So once you do that, you hit submit. It does take a little bit for it to get approved, but once it is approved, you do get a notification of the approval, and then it's officially marked on the site. And like I said earlier, you'll get yearly emails as a grower to update your site and make any changes that need to be necessary or necessary to be made. Finally, then, there are quite a few different help resources on the page. So if you have specific topics or specific questions, there are quite a few resources there for you to check out. And then finally, you do have the option to purchase signs as a grower. I don't know if anybody's seen any of these signs out and about. I've seen a few in different parts of the state. Seen several of the bee check ones, I think, in different areas. But as a specialty growers, another just way to notify people of that location, you can purchase these signs through the website as well. And that order form is on the site there with the other information.